Brought to you by Wikivideo Documentaries. Murder of Lynette White. Lynette Deborah White was murdered on the 14th of February 1988 in Cardiff, Wales. South Wales police issued a photo-fit image of a blood-stained, white male seen in the vicinity at the time of the murder, but were unable to trace the man. In November 1988, the police charged 5 black and mixed-race men with White's murder, although none of the scientific evidence discovered at the crime scene could be linked to them. In November 1990, following what was then the longest murder trial in British history, 3 of the men were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. In December 1992, the convictions were ruled unsafe and quashed by the Court of Appeal after it was decided that the police investigating the murder had acted improperly. The wrongful conviction of the 3 men has been called one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in recent times. The police insisted that the men had been released purely on a legal technicality, that they would be seeking no other suspects, and resisted calls for the case to be reopened. In January 2002, new DNA technology enabled forensic scientists to obtain a reliable crime scene DNA profile. The extracted profile led police to the real killer, Jeffrey Gaffor, who confessed to White's murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Controversially, Gaffor received a shorter minimum tariff than had been given to the wrongfully convicted men. In 2004, the Independent Police Complaints Commission began a review of the conduct of the police during the original inquiry. Over the next 12 months, around 30 people were arrested in connection with the investigation, 19 of whom were serving or retired police officers. In 2007, 3 of the prosecution witnesses who gave evidence at the original murder trial were convicted of perjury and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. In 2011, 8 former police officers were charged with conspiring to pervert the course of justice. Their subsequent trial was the largest police corruption trial in British criminal history. A further 4 police officers were due to be tried on the same charges in 2012. In November 2011, the trial collapsed when the defense claimed that copies of files which they said they should have seen had instead been destroyed. As a result, the judge ruled that the defendants could not receive a fair trial and they were acquitted. In January 2012, the missing documents were found, still in the original box in which they had been sent to South Wales Police by the IPCC. Lynette White. White had left school without any qualifications and had been working as a prostitute since she was 14 years old. Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed White a few weeks before her murder as part of an investigation into child prostitution. Rogers said that White was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time. Acquaintances said that she would be the first girl out at lunchtime, and the last one left at night, even working on Christmas Day. Described by friends as pretty and popular, White earned around £100 each night. She told Rogers that she had been drugged and taken to Bristol by a gang of men who forced her into prostitution, and that even after eventually making her way back to Cardiff she had found herself trapped in a continual spiral of prostitution. By 1988 she was working every day to pay for her boyfriend Stephen Pineapple Miller's cocaine addiction. Miller, who was also her pimp, took at least £60 £90 each day from White, who was his only source of income. Each day he would drive her to Riverside, Cardiff, where she plied her trade, before meeting with her at the North Star Club in the evenings to collect her earnings. The two lived together at a flat in Dorset Street, Cardiff. White went missing 5 days before her murder and made no contact with Miller or any of her friends or known associates. Her whereabouts during this period or the reason for her disappearance have never been ascertained. She was due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials, and it was later conjectured that she was deliberately lying low to avoid giving evidence. The first trial involved an allegation of attempted murder, and the second involved an allegation of attempting to procure the services of a 13-year-old girl for prostitution. When White disappeared, the police began actively searching for her, and a judge issued a warrant for her arrest to ensure that she attended the first trial, which was listed to commence at Cardiff Crown Court on the 15th of February 1988. Earlier in February 1988, another prostitute, Lern Wildé, had loaned White the keys to the flat in James Street where she was later murdered, for the purpose of taking clients there for sex. After White disappeared, Valde was unable to get into the flat herself without the keys, and on the evening of the 14th of February she asked taxi driver Eddie Diamond, who knew both women, to take her to the address. There Valde was able to get another occupant to drop a spare set of keys from a window to open the main door of the building, but was still unable to enter her own flat. Diamond and Valde then drove to Buttown Police Station to report the situation and their concerns about White's disappearance. They returned to James Street with P.S. William Bisgood, P.C. Simon Johnson and P.C. Anthony Prosser, who were expecting to serve the arrest warrant on White and then take her into police custody. On arrival, Valde and Diamond remained outside while the police forced entry and, at 9:17 p.m. found White's body inside. P.C. Johnson later testified that he was aware that White was a missing witness in a court case and that officers had been looking for her. P.C. Prosser said, "We had been looking for her all weekend." He said he discovered White lying on her back on the floor of a bedroom in the flat, having suffered massive injuries. Murder. White's throat had been cut from the right ear across the front and around to the left side of the neck, exposing the bones of the spine. There were multiple stab wounds to her chest and breasts, and other wounds to her face, stomach, arms, wrists and inner thighs, as well as defensive wounds on her hands. Bernard Knight, the pathologist who conducted White's autopsy, described it as a mutilating attack with sexual overtones, and identified a total of 69 wounds. Although she had been stabbed 7 times in the heart, he concluded that it was the throat injury which had killed her. He said, "It would require considerable force, because the skin, muscles, larynx and voice box had been cut right down to the neck bone." Speculating on how the wound could have been inflicted, he said it was a normal reflex for a person to keep their head down in such a situation, and her head may have been forcibly held back for the knife wound to be inflicted. One of the 2 t-shirts Lynette was wearing was absolutely lacerated. It looked like a colander. Knight believed the murder weapon was at least 5 inches long. He determined that she had died between midnight and 4 a.m. Her wristwatch had stopped at 1:45 a.m., leading the police to conclude that this was the most likely time of death. White's body was discovered between the foot of the bed, the room's only furniture, and the window, still clothed, but with one shoe off. There was heavy blood staining to the base of the bed, the carpet and the walls of the room. There was very little blood on the mattress, where an opened, but unused condom was found. Forensic examination found 150 different sets of finger and palm prints in the flat. A zoospermic semen was present both in White's vagina and underwear, which pathologists determined had been deposited there within 6 hours of her death. Some of the blood found on White's clothing, including her exposed sock, was found to be from a male with the blood type AB. Investigation. The subsequent murder inquiry was led by Detective Chief Superintendent John Williams, the head of South Wales Police's Criminal Investigation Department. Appeals for information led to several potential witnesses independently describing a white male, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, 5 feet 10 inches, aged in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a disheveled appearance. He was seen in a distressed state in the vicinity of the James Street flat in the early hours of the 14th of February, appeared to have cut himself on the hand, and had blood on his clothing. An e-fit of the suspect was compiled, and on the 17th of March 1988 Dees Williams appeared on the BBC television programme Crime Watch UK, where he stated that the police believed this man was responsible for White's murder. Williams said, "This man almost certainly had the blood of the deceased on him." On the 25th of February the police detained an individual who bore a striking resemblance to the e-fit, but he was released the following day after providing an alibi corroborated by a third party. The suspect seen outside the flat has never been positively identified. Elimination of suspects. Francine Caudle, whom White had been due to testify against, and Caudle's mother Peggy Farrugia were also initially considered suspects, but the discovery of the blood on White's clothing allowed the police to eliminate them from their inquiries. Stephen Miller was questioned at the beginning of the inquiry, having been picked up by the police early on the 15th of February, but after giving a statement detailing his whereabouts during the crucial period, He was released without charge and the police announced that he had been ruled out of their investigations. When Miller was first taken in by the police for questioning, he was still wearing the clothes that he had been wearing at the time of the murder. These were dirty and unwashed. The police even joked with Miller during his initial interview that he should sit in the opposite corner of the room due to the smell of his clothing. But there were no traces of blood found on them. His car was also forensically examined with no result, and his blood type did not match that found on White's clothing. Another witness, David Orton, also gave a statement to the police detailing his movements with Miller during the time of the murder, completely corroborating Miller's alibi. Mr. X. On the 20th of April 1988, DC Jeff Thomas put together a list of 12 people of interest, based on their previous criminal activities. One of the men, whose identity has never been publicly revealed and was referred to only as Mr. X, was a convicted sex offender and pedophile who lived around 20 minutes driving distance from James Street, was known to use prostitutes, and was a frequent visitor to Cardiff. He had a history of mental illness and had been classified as a psychopath by his doctor. When interviewed by the police, he admitted that he had in the past paid White for sex, and was unable to account for his movements or provide an alibi for the period of the murder. Crucially for the investigating officers, Mr. X was of blood type AB. Mr. X was interviewed by Detective Constables Graham Toogood and Paul Fish, who believed that, had he been pressed, he would have confessed to White's murder. It was decided, however, to adopt a softly approach until they had DNA results from the crime scene. On the 19th of October 1988, Detective Inspector Graham Mountcher placed Mr. X under surveillance for 3 days to identify his routines and associates. The policeman's main concern was that Mr. X would voluntarily commit himself to a mental institution if he became aware of the surveillance. But, by the 25th of October, D.I. Mountcher was so convinced that he was the killer that he requested further surveillance. This took place between 27 and the 30th of October 1988. On the 7th of November 1988, Detective Chief Inspector Adrian Morgan informed Dees Williams that Mr. X was now the prime suspect. On the 9th of November 1988, the results of the DNA analysis eliminated Mr. X from the investigation. Paul Atkins and Mark Gromk. Although their prime suspect had been eliminated from the inquiry, the police had collected thousands of statements through interviews and door-to-door inquiries. After the collapse of their case against Mr. X, the police now returned to these. Among them were statements from Paul Atkins and Mark Gromk, two associates of Mr. X. Gromk was the tenant of the flat immediately above that where White was murdered. Both Atkins and Gromk were homosexual and had previous convictions for petty crimes, which made them, in the view of Satish Sarkar, susceptible to police pressure. Both men gave alibis for their whereabouts at the time of the murder, but under pressure from the police. Atkins eventually gave a statement on the 26th of April in which he first said that Gromk had killed White, and then confessed to killing her himself. Detective Chief Inspector John Ludlow recorded that Atkins first stated that Gromk had gone to the flat to have sex with White, and after hearing a scream, Atkins went downstairs and saw Gromk exiting the flat covered in blood and carrying a blood-stained knife. Atkins later said he had met White himself in the Custom House pub and went back to the flat to have sex with her. He then wrestled her to the floor, sat astride her and stabbed her. As the statement contained 4 completely different accounts in the one document, it was not treated seriously. Ronnie Williams. Yusuf Abdullahi had been questioned as part of the routine door-to-door inquiries. At the time of the murder, he had been working on board the ship MV Coral Sea, some 8 miles away in Barry Docks. Although he did not realize this at the time, his common-law wife Jackie Harris was having an affair with Jeff Smith, a South Wales police officer attached to the Vice Squad. His common-law brother-in-law, Ronnie Williams, was also a police informant. Williams began passing information to the police in March 1988, much of it unreliable, including a claim that White had been stabbed in the Casablanca Club in Buttown before being moved to the flat in James Street. Initially, he claimed that Abdullahi knew the identity of the killer and was concealing this information, but later he began to implicate him more directly with the murder, and claimed that Abdullahi had been able to leave work at the Coral Sea on the night of the murder without his colleagues being aware. It was well known by their associates and the police that Abdullahi and Williams detested each other. On the 19th of May 1988, Detective Inspector Richard Powell took a formal statement from Abdullahi in which he gave details of his work on the Coral Sea. Liane Valde. Liane Valde had also been placed under pressure during her interviews, particularly as it was she who had initially raised the alarm with the police, who felt she may be concealing information. She too was vulnerable, being a single parent, a lesbian, a drug addict, and a prostitute. The police were visiting her daily, leading to her being asked to leave the flat she shared with her friend Angela Saylor, who was also a prostitute. She began lodging with another couple, who also complained that the police were calling round to speak with Valde on an almost daily basis. On the 19th of May 1988, while drunk, Valde eventually named Miller and Yusuf Abdullahi as the killers in front of several other prostitutes. That evening she was questioned by PS David Hathaway and agreed that she had named the two men while drunk, but said this was a false accusation as a result of drunken rambling, and that she had heard the names from D.I. Powell when he had questioned her earlier in the day. She was then asked by the police if she would agree to be hypnotized, and a session with a hypnotherapist was scheduled. Violet Perry Violet Elizabeth Perry was a secretary at a Cardiff yacht club who knew many police officers through working behind the club's bar. On the 10th of November 1988, the day after Mr. X was cleared of any involvement, Perry gave a statement to the police that she had been driving home from the club and had passed 7 James Street at around 1:30 a.m. on the night that White was murdered. She claimed that she saw 4 excited black males outside the building, arguing and gesticulating, and recognized 2 of them as John Akhti and Rashid Omar, who was of mixed race. John Akhti had earlier responded to the door-to-door inquiries and told the police that on the night of the murder he had gone to the Casablanca club at around midnight, and had left there at around 3:30 a.m. John Akhti was the cousin of Liane Valde's boyfriend, Ronnie Akhti. Perron's statement was the breakthrough needed by the police, and her allegation that she saw John Akhti and others at or near the scene of the murder allowed the investigation to take a new direction after it had reached an impasse following the elimination of Mr. X. Angela Saylor. Angela Saylor lived in a flat at St. Clair's Court, Buttown, which had an unrestricted view of the front of 7 James Street. Described later as one of the most vulnerable members of Cardiff society, Saylor had an IQ of just 55, indicating mild mental retardation. Armed with Perron's statement placing the group of black men outside the flat at the time of the murder, the police questioned Saylor on the 17th of November 1988 and insisted that she was somehow connected with the crime. In the first of 2 statements taken that day, Saylor claimed that Miller visited her at about 1 a.m. on the 14th of February looking for White. 2.5 hours later she gave another statement claiming that she saw Miller, John, and Ronnie Akhti, Abdullahi, Tony Paris and Tony Brace outside 7 James Street. She also claimed to have heard screams from the flat and to have seen Ronnie Akhti talking up to someone in the window of Grumk's flat before being let into the building. The same day, Grumk and Atkins gave new statements to the police saying that they had also seen a group of men outside the flat, including Ronnie Akhti and Abdullahi, during his first interview. In the morning, Grumk had stated that he knew nothing about the murder, but by the afternoon he had given a very detailed account of the circumstances surrounding the crime. Grumk also said that he had opened the door to the building to let Ronnie Akhti in, and both he and Atkins now claim that they too had heard screams that night. Brought to you by Wikivideo Documentaries. Would you like to know more?